A very warm welcome to all of you on behalf of the organizers, the EU Tax Observatory, the Center of Economic Behavior and Inequality, and Oxfam EVIS. My name is Christian Hallum. I work with Oxfam on tax justice, and I would also like to give a very warm welcome to those of you who are joining online for this event today. We do have an audience here in the room as well, and we'll be taking questions from both online and from the room. For those of you online, if you have questions, please post them in the chat box, and they will be read out here in the room. If you have any technical issues online with the sound or anything else, please write in the chat box, and we have a team standing by to try to help you. The event will be recorded. If you prefer to remain anonymous, you should be able to change your name. For those of you who are joining on Zoom, you can free to choose any name you like. I wanted to say a few words before we get started on why we wanted to have the event today and why we're focusing on the topic. And I think I'll start by mentioning that according to the Tax Justice Network, we lose the equivalent of a nurse's salary every second because of tax havens. And that means that by the end of this short conference, we would have lost the equivalent of 7,200 nurses' salaries. I'm not sharing these figures to try to be dramatic or anything, but I think it does show or illustrate why this topic for today is important. Tax havens and financial secrecy harm all of us, and not just through the massive revenue losses, but also by undermining our democracy, by allowing the wealth and influence of a tiny elite to grow exponentially. They also taint our institutions and promote corruption by allowing illicit money to flow in and out of our political system, our financial systems. And they also widen the gap between developing countries who are most severely impacted by tax havens, and the funds tend to end up here in Europe and other rich parts of the world where many of the tax havens are based. So these are some of the negative effects that those of us that have been fighting tax havens for years are familiar with. But of course, tax havens are really in the news because of a totally different reason these days, and that's the reason of Russian oligarchs and the sanctions that we're trying to impose on them. And as we discuss the solutions to financial secrecy today, that is of course one aspect, but I implore you to keep in mind all these other reasons also for why it's important to stop financial secrecy. And also when we discuss solutions, that we need to find solutions that not only allow us to sanction a few oligarchs, but really deal with the fundamental and systemic issues of financial secrecy. And to help us discuss those solutions, I'm really delighted that we have a great panel for you today. I'll briefly introduce them. We have Annette Alstedt-Sæther, who is a professor at the Norwegian University of Science. We have Rasmus Corlin Christensen, a postdoc at Copenhagen Business School. We have Niels Johansen, who is a professor at the University of Copenhagen and also a member of the EU Tax Observatory. We have Lars Koch, who is the Secretary General of Oxfam EVIS. And with us online, we are joined by Chinai Mukumba, who is a Policy Research and Advocacy Manager at the Tax Justice Network Africa. And finally, we have Panos Nikolaides, who is a Director of Research at the EU Tax Observatory and a PhD researcher at the Hertie School of Berlin. And to help us make sense of all the great input that comes from this panel and help us make sure we hear from everyone, we're joined by our moderator, the fantastic Emma Agimang from the Financial Times. Emma is the Financial Times global tax correspondent. And we're very grateful for you to accept us to moderate us today, Emma. So over to you. Thank you.
Christian. So I'm going to we're going to have 5-minute introductions from all our panelists to start off with, and then we're going to have a panel discussion led by me to talk about in depth more of the issues that are brought up as we go along. And then we're also going to have time for audience questions at the end. So I'd encourage everyone, both online and in the room, to please, ask as many questions as we can. We're going to try and get through as much of that as we can. And at the very end of the event, we're also going to have some time for nibbles and drinks and a bit of a social time as well. So I'm very excited to be here, and I'd like to say thank you to Christian and to EU Tax Observatory and Oxfam IBIS for inviting me. As Christian has said, this is a very important topic, and it's only going to be increasing in importance as some of the issues we've talked about in relation to Russian, sanctions, but also in relation to the importance of actually understanding the effect of tax havens on all of us, really. So, yeah, for me, that's it for me from now. And then we're going to have our panelists come up one by one and give a brief introduction to their areas of expertise. And then after that, we're going to move into the discussion. So, thank you for now. Who should come up first? Shall we have Annette come up first?
Thank you. And thank you for inviting me. So one of the main services provided or sold by tax havens is secrecy. And the definition of secrecy, you don't want anybody to know what's going on. This has been a bit more challenging over time. It's not as easy anymore to just have a secret bank account in Switzerland and go with a plastic bag of money over the borders. We have now automatic exchange of information between more than 100 countries. So it's more difficult to hide money in banks now. You have to more, like if you want to hide financial accounts, you have to do it more sophisticatedly. So it's more expensive. You have more advisors. What is more easy now is to hide money in real estate. So that's what we now fear. That it's less available to hide money in financial estates, but we expect them to flow over the real estate. And we don't know much about that. We know that's going on, but we don't know much about it. And then I would just, together with Gabriel Zuckman, Blueberry Planterose, and Andreas Økland, we have released a new paper where we utilized a new leak. There were data on we can actually observe, we can open the blankets and see behind the covers of a big tax haven. So there was information on 800,000 properties leaked to a Washington based think tank, Center for Advanced Defense Studies. We have gotten access to use those for research, and we are able to analyze for the first time the full extent of ownership of Dubai properties, and foreign ownership is huge. So we estimate that more than 146 billion American dollars is held by foreigners. And when we look at what's owned by Norwegians and Danes, we can see that the majority of that is actually hidden. So much of that is hidden. The main owners of these foreign properties are actually Indians, by 20%, but then UK citizens own 10% of the foreign-owned properties in Dubai. So other big owners are Gulf countries and Russia. And also the EU is also a big owners, and the US. So for the first time, we're actually able to attribute owners to all of these foreign properties. We can see where they come from. We see that it's characterized, but see that historical ties seems to be important. When we see that, neighboring countries and all historical ties, UK seems to be important. But we also see that there's a big overrepresentation of countries that are war-ridden or autocracies, whereas that indication that these money are held by elites. So these are huge huge numbers. And one of the big problems is that money are hidden. We can't get access. And at the same time, journalists in more than 20 countries have used these data to see, basically showcases who own them. And we see that these are owned by elite, by criminals and tax evaders, and also by normal guys. Because it's not illegal to own properties in Dubai. You should remember that. It's tax haven. It's not illegal to have properties or ownership or companies through tax havens, but they can be used for illicit purposes. So you should always keep that in mind. But so this is just the first time, we can get back to this later, but this is the first sign, actually, like first indication that what we expect is going on, that money is flowing into assets that we can't observe through automatic exchange. And it's a clear sign that we should work more on information exchange to basically lift the secrecy veil, like make it impossible for people to hide stuff, like make it impossible for states to make money from providing services to hide ownership, assets, and transactions. And that's the way ahead. 1 minute, I'll stop now so that we have more time for discussion. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. I'm Rasmus Christensen, and I'm a researcher at Copenhagen Business School. And what I'm going to try to sort of provide here is a little bit of a historical and a political perspective on some of the themes that we're going to be discussing today, and to try to sort of conceptualize some of the recent initiatives and discussions around uncovering hidden wealth, cracking down on tax havens, in a context of increasing attention to transparency in global tax, financial transparency over the last couple of decades. And I think one sort of useful way of thinking about some of the current discussions is to contextualize it in terms of recent waves of transparency that have happened since the 1990s. So various different eras of political initiative, each driven by different political momentums with different goals, but all sharing the same overall aim of providing more transparency around tax havens and to uncover hidden wealth. And we can think about these waves as more recently starting, as I said, in the 1990s, which is when really the first international reckoning in the global community started with some of the collective issues that have been emerging over the course of the 20th century as a result of the growth of tax havens and more broadly the globalized economy. So famously, the OECD in the mid-1990s started their harmful tax competition project, which was the first sort of attempt at forcing tax havens around the world, and especially small island states in the Caribbean and Pacific that were at that time perceived as being the most important tax havens, to sort of coerce them into engaging in more information exchange, provide more information to outsiders about the affairs that were going on in their territories. It was a very limited kind of conception of information exchange, and the project largely failed at the time, in part because there wasn't a lot of political attention, and especially the United States were not supporters of the project when George W. Bush was elected as president. What lacked in the 1990s with this wave of transparency, political momentum, really came in the wave that came in the 2000s, especially the late 2000s, around the time of the global financial crisis, which really provided a strong political momentum for providing new regulation around transparency. And it was around that time that the G20, as the new kind of global political powerhouse, the largest economies in the world united, were trying to set up a new political agenda in the wake of the global financial crisis and sort of try to set out the things that needed to be fixed. And tax havens, they identified as one of the key issues, and especially the banking secrecy in tax havens as one of the main problems around that time. Famously, in 2009, the G20 political leaders sent out a communique saying that the era of banking secrecy was over. That turned out to be not quite true. Some of Niels's research and others' research has shown that statement was not quite accurate. The G20 initiative to crack down on tax havens and force them to join these information exchange agreements had some effect on the location of cross-border bank deposits, but overall the system system of secrecy remained largely in place, in part as a result of elites being able to convert their bank deposits to other types of assets, like real estate that we're seeing now, that were not covered by exchange of information agreements. Then we had another wave of transparency initiatives in the 2010s, which was really a great leap forward, I think, for transparency regulation and global financial transparency. That was motivated in part by the aftermaths of the global financial crisis and the increasing public attention to issues of transparency, to issues of tax havens and the global tax system more broadly. So we had a wave of waves of new initiatives, both in terms of transparency around individuals, tax affairs with automatic exchange of information, enacted both regionally in the US and at the global levels, but also more broadly, transparency around beneficial ownership took a great step forward, transparency of corporate tax payments with issues like regulations like country-by-country reporting were being enacted across the world and still are being enacted. This was pretty radical. And this sort of provides the backdrop for where we're now heading today. And I think the 2020s could provide a setting where there's a new wave, a new radical and groundbreaking wave of transparency that is emerging, where we're talking about wealth registers, asset registration, and pretty powerful ideas motivated by these geopolitical fractures, most recently illustrated by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So this is pretty interesting and a pretty powerful platform, I think, for what's going to happen in the next 10 years. But whether it materializes remains to be seen, and I'm sure we'll discuss that today as well. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Niels Johannessen, and I'm from the University of Copenhagen. I think this is a good place to kind of take stock of what we actually know about offshore wealth. So I would say that like 10 years ago, we knew virtually nothing. There were just like no really good quantitative studies out there on offshore wealth. And today, I think we know a whole lot. Which is, I mean, partly due to the interest of academics, but also like journalists have been pushing this forward with all the leaks that have been published in the press and also been shared with academics, creating these synergies between academics and journalists. So let me just put this like in qualitative terms, not to get into fights about details, but I mean, so I'll try to describe kind of 5 facts about, what do we know about wealth in offshore havens. So one is that there are pretty large amounts out there, both in absolute terms and also measured relative to like total household wealth or GDP or stuff like that. So we're talking thousands of $billions by any measure. Also, so these offshore structures, they can take many forms involving, like holding companies and trusts and funds and so on. And they can be used to hold many forms of wealth. So it's not just deposits, not just shares and bonds. It's also, as highlighted, real estate, for example. It could be gold or paintings or other kind of valuable items. We also know that, some of these offshore structures, at least some of them, are used to evade taxes in the home country of the owner, right? So like the basic idea is just, I have an account in a tax haven, I earn money in that account, and I don't tell my home tax authorities about that money. It's not the only use of these offshore accounts, so we also know that, they play a role in criminal activities, they play a role in money laundering, they play a role in like hiding the proceeds from corruption and so on, but tax evasion is one like important motivation. That was fact number 3. We also know that, these offshore structures are used predominantly by the very wealthy. So whenever we're able to to look into the microeconomics of this, we see that there is like a very, very steep kind of wealth gradient or income gradient in the use of these structures. It's really something that the very wealthy do, no matter whether you're talking about real estate in Dubai or secret accounts in Switzerland or whatever. And then finally, we also know that, the tax revenue that we lose due to these transactions through offshore jurisdictions is non-trivial. I would say like it's not probably big enough to solve all our problems, but it's still like big enough to consider important. And you can say if you're combining kind of some of the last facts about like the wealth gradient is being used by the wealthiest considerable amounts, you can say that there's a scope here for actually, I mean, the tax progressivity has been eroded in many countries over the past decades, and there's a scope here for actually redressing some of this tax progressivity by cracking down on offshore havens. So I also want to highlight some of the new policies. I think there's really, there have been many policy initiatives, but there's one that really stands out as mind-blowingly ambitious in a sense, which is the automatic information exchange that Annette and Rasmus were talking about. So what does it mean in practice? It means that if I tomorrow go to Zurich, or I go to Luxembourg, or I go to Jersey and open an account and put like some assets there, next year in September, the Danish tax authorities will get a letter from these places saying, well, Niels has money here, like he has this amount, and he earned this income through this account. This is really, it means that tax havens in the way we knew them as places where, things were just secret, they don't really exist in the same way anymore. And I think it's really very, just considering like how difficult it is to agree about anything in these international fora, and especially about tax. It's really incredible that now like more than 100 countries, and including all major tax havens, cooperate in this way. It's also important to stress that this is kind of like this kind of policy is really what tax experts were. There was the wettest dream of tax experts before it happened, right? This was really what people said. This is what we need to really enforce taxes on foreign wealth. So incredibly ambitious that 100 countries collaborate in this sense. Even though like there are large costs, right? It's not trivial like what it costs to banks to set this up. It's not trivial what it costs to some private persons, like try to talk to Americans who settle down in Denmark and all the trouble they have to go through with the local bank to, in terms of forms and so on related to this initiative and so on. I don't have a whole lot of time left, but I think to me, like this policy now raises like at least two really important questions. So one is, we've invested all this in this global policy, this new form of cooperation, and we need to get a good understanding of how well it works. So to what extent have we now solved the problem? Have we cracked down on offshore evasion by setting up the system? Or to what extent are there still ways to get around this? So maybe the smartest or wealthiest, the most sophisticated, they still find loopholes in this system. And we can talk much more about kind of some of these loopholes are like little details, but they might matter a whole lot. And the other question is like what can be done to improve it? So there probably are loopholes, and the question is like what can we do to improve this form of cooperation? These are kind of the two first order questions to me, and I think that the best way to address them is really in cooperations between researchers like people in this panel and governments. Like we need to work together with tax authorities to understand, to use all the data they're collecting and to put them together in the best way, and also to understand like what kind of challenges they are facing when they try to use the data to raise taxes. So I guess I don't have a whole lot of time left, so I'll just stop right here. Thank you.
It's very good that Niels finishes with questions, because I was planning to start with questions, and we're actually very much aligned. And my intervention has to do mostly with a paper that we have written in the EU, yes, in the EU Tax Observatory with Teresa Neef, Luca Chancel, Thomas Piketty, and Gabriel Zuckman on the effectiveness of sanctions against oligarchs, given the recent developments that we see in the world. And in this note, we basically advocate for a European Asset Registry where beneficial owners of wealth are effectively recorded, and this is done so in a systematic and transparent way. So the questions that we've started with was one of effectiveness of sanctions, and how effective governments have been in introducing these sanctions. So if we go back to March, they were scrambling a little bit to find ways of approaching the issue. They're still approaching the issue with different task forces in ad hoc ways. We can also ask a question of what is missing. What is missing out there so that we approach the problem of missing wealth in a systematic way, and also not only for Russians, but also for all of nations and all of wealth that exists out there. So let me take a step back and go back to Russia and what we face today. To answer the question, I would say it's a question of difficulty of sanctions, and this comes from the lack of information and the lack of coordination between countries. This is what is driving it. The lack of information and coordination comes from the lack of who owns what and where. And there is a broader issue that relates to offshore secrecy. Russia exhibits the highest concentration of wealth in Europe. The top 1%, the wealthiest in the Russian population, owns about half of the household wealth. And we know from research by Niels and Annette and Gabriel Zuckman as well, that most of this wealth, about 60% of the top 0.01%, is held abroad. Sanctions have tried to target about a handful of individuals up to now, but this 0.01% is around 10,000 individuals. So it's a significantly broader group. And at the same time, they have family members, they can transfer the property as well. So there is a wider group in this group that can be sanctioned. But as I have said, this phenomenon is not only a Russian phenomenon. What we observe today, it's basically a testament to what we have built, to the world we have built these days. And as a solution, this is my last point, we have set out a vision about the European Asset Registry, where all the information are linked of who owns wealth and where do they use it. And when there is a transfer, this is systematically recorded. The important thing here is the following. The information exists, especially in European countries. We have information from listed companies, from unlisted companies. We have information of movable and immovable property. Of course, this can be improved in the different member states. We have national beneficial owner registries in some of the countries at least, but there is a commitment at least from some of the countries to set them up. And so we have a wealth of information that can be linked together. And what we lack is a structure that can put all this together and year by year update them and record them in a systematic way so that we know who owns the wealth, and also this can help us target the different sanctions. So I will end here, and I will let the rest for the panel discussion.
Thank you. My name is Lars Koch. I'm Secretary General of Oxfam IBIS. And Niels, just a comment to you. Journalists and civil society, I believe, have played a quite important role in setting the agenda on why we are standing here today and discussing tax havens and secrecy. I mean, and that's, as a civil society organization, particularly working with the Global South, why are we engaged in this tax havenery? I mean, this is driving inequality. And what we have seen, particularly over the last 2 years with the pandemic, is a historic redistribution of wealth from poor people to rich people. I mean, what we have seen is that over the last 2 years of the pandemic, governments have invested $16 trillion in supporting workers, corporates to come through the crisis. $5 trillion of these dollars trickled directly into the pockets of the billionaires of the world. I mean, the billionaires have risen their fortunes at a historic level over the last year particularly. I mean, it's a dramatic redistribution to billionaires today. And at the same time, we for the first time in 2 decades see a rise in extreme poverty. We're seeing probably more than 200 million people driven into extreme poverty. It is ridiculous what is happening. It's outrageous. It's unacceptable at all levels what is happening these years. And this inequality, this poverty, is to a large extent driven by rich people, elites, oligarchs, whatever we call them, their ability to hide their wealth offshore. That's why we engage in tax havenery. That's why we are so happy to co-facilitate this conference today. And what we also see, and this is also important, the point of departure here is very much the oligarchs in Russia and how we can address their wealth. I mean, what we also see now is a dramatic economic crisis in the global south, countries going bankrupt, not being able to increase, they are reducing the investment in health, in education, and social services these days. They can't pay their bills. That's where we stand right now. And this is driven again by, rich elites in these countries, stealing assets from the countries and hiding them offshore. So the solutions that we are looking for as Oxfam, it's super important that we use this never waste a good crisis of Ukraine. The targeting the oligarchs, but remembering that we need systemic changes, that we need to also address the oligarchs of Africa, of Asia, of Denmark, or Russia. We have to address them all. There have to be systemic changes that we work for, and we use this crisis to push for these systemic changes. And that is all about transparency, and my colleagues have mentioned a lot of that. That is about beneficial ownership registers, public beneficial owner registers of corporates. It's automatic exchange of information, which is, as you say, Neil, super important. However, most African countries are excluded from this automatic exchange of information from banks. They're not included in this exchange. So the third thing, this asset registry, can we develop a European, a global asset registry? Super important. But let's keep in mind that those who are suffering the most from tax havenery, that's the developing countries. So let's do it different from what has been happening, or the tax reform on corporates from OECD, which generated some important results, but excluded all the interest of developing countries. They won't gain a penny from the corporate reforms that have been provided by OECD. So remember to include developing countries in the measures that we are taking now. And also, third, final thing, this is not only about money, this is also about power. We have to address that these oligarchs, these rich elites, they're using their stolen assets to influence our policies. And that's why it makes it so difficult to introduce measures like an asset registry or like a wealth tax, which is hardly needed now. We have to introduce these measures, and we have to, in order to achieve that, we have to address the political capture we see these rich elites taking over our democracies. So that's what we are trying to work for. Thank you.
Okay, just to say that we're going to have, I believe, a presentation also from Chine Makumba, and she's online. So we're just waiting for that.
Thank you so much for this opportunity to be able to speak to this conference. It's such an important point, and I think just to reiterate the point that Lars made, I think this conversation about the importance of this discussion, particularly at a global level, is something that the institution that I work for really spends a lot of time thinking on. Just by way of very quick introduction, my name is Chanaim Kuma, and I work for an institution called the Tax Justice Network Africa. And really what we try to do is work with various stakeholders on the continent to help address the scourge of illicit financial flow. So this is the resources that essentially are generated within the continent flowing outside of the continent. So to give a bit of a background, in 2015 there was a seminal report that was released that put the figure of the amount of money that's leaving the continent at $50 billion. This was the first time there had been an effort to try and actually give a quantitative figure to the amount of resources that was leaving the continent. And really what it did is it brought to the fore this conversation of illicit financial flows and really necessitated the need to be able to find ways to keep these resources within the continent. This report identified a number of different issues that African countries were essentially besotted with, that was essentially facilitating these illicit financial flows. So some of these issues included tax incentives that African governments, for example, were giving corporates. It included double taxation agreements that African governments were entering into. But one of the key areas that was highlighted within this report was essentially the lack of beneficial ownership transparency. It's interesting though, because a number of years later, another report was put out 2 years ago that actually indicated that this figure that African countries are now losing has almost doubled. The latest figure of illicit financial flows that are coming out of the African continent are now at $89 billion. And to put this in a bit of context, when you take a look at some of the developmental objectives of the African continent, $89 billion is almost half of Africa's financing gap in order to help it meet its sustainable development goals. But not only that, this figure of $89 billion is more than the continent receives in overseas development assistance, which sits at about $48 billion annually, as well as foreign direct investment, which is about $54 billion. And I think one of the things that this really speaks to us about when we work on this issue on the continent is that really the resources that are required for Africa to invest in its own self, as well as help meet its developmental objectives, are within the continent. But because of the scourge of illicit financial flows, essentially Africa now finds itself having to look outward. Research has actually shown that when you're taking a look at the impact of illicit financial flows, it's not just the resources that are leaving the continent, but there are also multiplier effects. Countries that have high illicit financial flows have been shown to spend 42% 42% compared to other countries on their education, on the education sector, and only about 75% compared to all other countries on their health sector, really speaking to the way in which these illicit financial flows negatively impact African countries. And so Lars really made this point about the fact that there is inequity that we're really seeing as a result of illicit financial flows, and the lack of transparency when you're taking a look at the wealth that exists within the globe really exacerbates these situations. What's particularly pertinent when we're taking a look at this conversation is, although most of the resources, when you're taking a look at resources that are essentially flowing out of countries, the number is much more significant from richer developed countries, but the negative impacts that are felt by African countries are much, much more detrimental. Essentially, resources that are leaving the continent are resources that aren't being spent in the health sector, in the education sector, as well as even in the social protection sector. And when you think through some of the shocks that are essentially besetting the global economic systems, you can only see the extent to which African countries are now significantly much more vulnerable than they were before. And not only that, because of the way we are seeing various issues affect the global system, we're seeing many countries also become much more inward looking and less prone to providing assistance to other countries. And so there is much more of a need now for countries, particularly African countries, to see how they can hone in mobilizing resources domestically.
However, whenever African countries are trying to do so, their efforts are impeded, and they will continue to be impeded in so long as there continues to exist tax havens as well as secrecy jurisdictions. I think it's already been indicated that we have over $1 trillion that's sitting in tax havens outside of countries where those resources were generated. These are resources that, if maintained within their countries of generation, could essentially be channeled into these key sectors. It's so important to identify ways to address those issues. And this particular point of beneficial ownership transparency is really one that as an institution, we do a lot of work around. We're seeing across the continent a number of different countries, because of this issue, really now starting to put in place measures to promote beneficial ownership transparency. As an institution, what we advocate for is public beneficial ownership transparency, because we see the role that various stakeholders can play essentially in being able to ensure that elites are not funneling funds outside of the countries. The extent of resources being channeled outside of countries was essentially also indicated by the Pandora paper leakage that we saw just a few years ago. Of the 330 politicians that were identified in the papers, out of those, 50 were Africans, including various heads of state. And essentially what these papers illustrated was just how those in public offices are able to exploit various corporate structures in order to hide their wealth. But in order to be able to address this, we need increased transparency. We need increased beneficial ownership, improved beneficial ownership legislation at a continental level. But more than that, we essentially need to see the doing away of tax havens and jurisdictions and secrecy jurisdictions outside of the globe, outside of the continent. A lot of people often tend to look at the situation within the African continent and ask essentially, what are the national measures that are being taken to address these issues? And absolutely, there are various measures that could be taken. But one of the things that we are always indicating as an institution is that as long as there exists a demand even outside of the continent, as long as there exists a space where these resources can be channeled to, the various measures that are essentially being put at national level will lack a certain level of effectiveness. And so the way in which to address this illicit financial flows is essentially global in nature. It's not one that can only be addressed at national level, but needs to be addressed at an international level. Because at the end of the day, the resources that leave the continent essentially go to these other countries that are creating the demand for these resources that leave the continent. And so I think this conversation about finding ways to improve transparency, this conversation about finding ways in which you can limit the extent to which elites are able to funnel their funds outside of the countries they exist in, is particularly important, not only at a global level, but as I mentioned earlier, for lower income and developing countries, because the impacts of these resources channeling out of these countries is much, much more severe. The need for those resources within African countries is much more pertinent. And so the extent to which there can be a global fight to addressing these issues is the extent to which we can begin to address the inequality gap that exists, not only within our own countries, but across countries as well. Happy to pick up any questions at a later stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Chinai. Thank you very much. And we're going to have the rest of our panel come up in front so we can go into the panel discussion. I think Chinai might need to head off, so just in case, I'm not quite sure if she's still with us or not, but if she isn't, thank you very much for your time and for your contributions. All right, great. Okay. Thank you all as well for those very brilliant and quick introductions to what I'm sure everyone has realised by now is a very, very big topic. And we're going to have a bit more of a discussion about some of the things that have been raised. But, you know, it is a big topic. So I think that the way to structure it, just to make it easier for us to keep a handle of all the different threads that have been revealed, is if we could talk initially first about the kind of problems, about the scale of the issue of offshore wealth, and the fact of the sort of secrecy, the financial secrecy that surrounds that. and then we can talk about the solutions that have been put into place, both current solutions, past solutions, and also potential future solutions. I mean, you mentioned panels, for example, the European Asset Registry. So just to keep us with some sort of structure, because it is such a big topic. So if I could turn first then to Niels, because you were talking about your research and about how 10 years ago we didn't really know very much at all about the extent of this issue. I'm just interested to understand, how exactly is hidden wealth measured? Because by the definition, it's hidden. So I mean, I just wonder how you get to quantitative estimates.
That's a great question. Does this work? Yeah. So there are different methods, and luckily that they yield estimates that are not so different, which enhance the credibility of them. So one is maybe the most spectacular, you could say, is one developed by the head of the EU Tax Observatory, luckily, Gabriel Zucman, where he says basically, when a Danish person, if I buy a Microsoft share, then it's going to be recorded in the US as a liability of the US against Denmark, and in Denmark as an asset against America. So it's kind of like in these global investment statistics, there's going to be a balance. But if I do the same thing, if I buy that Microsoft share through my hidden Swiss account, well, then the US is going to record like a liability against Switzerland. But Switzerland will know that there is no one Swiss involved, like in this scheme, so there will be no kind of asset recorded in Switzerland. And in Denmark, if I don't kind of report this asset in my tax return, no one in Denmark will know that a Danish person has an asset in the US. So like when you hide assets through secret accounts in tax havens, you get this gap in global investment statistics where you'll get more liabilities than assets. It will look like there are more people, if you owe more money away than people own, just because the owners are hidden. And basically, so there are a number and if you just sum up that gap, you get to something around $6 trillion, $7 trillion. And that's an estimate of the wealth hidden by households in tax havens.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And is that a year, or is that just sort of money that's sitting there?
That's the stock. So that's really the money that is sitting in there. That's very important to distinction, right, between kind of the flows of money and the stocks.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, interesting. So, and the other thing is that, it might sound like a bit of a basic question because we've talked already quite a lot about tax havens, but in the interest of just trying to define that, like what exactly is a tax haven? You've mentioned obviously the importance of the way they've used to hide assets and the gap that creates, but what makes a country a tax haven?
Yeah, I don't think it's very precisely defined. People use it in different contexts, like in different meanings. But I mean, so in the context, I think, of hidden wealth, it will be a place where it's good to hide hidden wealth. So there'll be a place with some kind of secrecy institutions. That could be banking secrecy. It could be like trust legislation that's very favorable. It could be like whatever allows you to hide things. And then it's so these countries are typically places that also use this in their own interest. So they're providing these institutions that allow for secrecy in order to make a gain, either in terms of government revenue or in terms of creating an industry around the secrecy with well-paid jobs, lawyers, accountants, advisors, and so on.
Mm-hmm. Okay, interesting. So there's a whole ecosystem of people catering to this. I'd like to turn to Rasmus just to sort of pick up on some of those points, because you were talking about the historical context and how there have been what you called these waves of transparency. So I'd just like to know if you could tell us a bit more about how tax havens came to be, and what Niels has talked about, how different countries sort of use them to make themselves attractive internationally to people wanting to keep wealth hidden. So why is that? What's the history behind it?
It's big questions outline the history of tax havens, but they've emerged, over hundreds of years for very different purposes. Some because of organic growth within the country that was favorable to secrecy and neutrality. Switzerland being a classic example of that, where elites from around the world have been hiding money for hundreds and hundreds of years. Others have more recently come into the tax haven industry, if you will, as a sort of strategic development goal. Some, unfortunately, very poor, low-income countries have been encouraged over the last 50 or so years to develop offshore financial centers and tax haven features as a sort of development strategy to reduce their dependence on other types of income. And then you have also, of course, today wealthy, rich, developed countries who are competing to attract investment, competing to attract these hidden money as well, and the ecosystem, support the ecosystem around them. We have certainly secrecy industries in the United States, in several countries in Europe, in the City of London, in the UK, that thrives on their status as well-developed economies with stable political systems and the ability to bring money in and out easily, but also offer some of the same favorable advantages in terms of secrecy, in terms of low transaction costs for moving your financial assets around. So there are very different paths and also very different types of tax havens, some specializing, as Niels said, in banking secrecy, others in secretive corporate structures, and there are specializations all around the world for specific industries and so on. So they're very different, and tax havens have developed in every corner of the world for very different domestic and international reasons.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. And this is kind of like an open question to sort of whoever wants to take it, really. But what do you think has been the reason, the ways in which people actually hide wealth currently? Because I mean, obviously, Rasmus, you were just talking about the different specialities that tax havens have, and Annette, you talked about real estate. Is that the sort of asset of choice now for people who want to? It's a bad way of putting it, Niels, but in the way that people who are exploiting the system, is that how people do that?
It's an easy question with a difficult answer. So I think if you want to hide big amounts of money, you want to use different methods, but the more money you want to hide and the more money you want to hide well, the more it costs. So there's a whole industry of advisors out there. The point is to utilize loopholes in the system, like utilize loopholes, inconsistencies in laws between countries, and to try to and also set up companies to hide real ownership. So the purpose is to hide it. So we see that oligarchs, they have like yachts, they have airplanes, so like you move money into real assets, but it should also be possible to hide it in financial assets as well. So do you have anything to add there? And Niels, you work with this now.
So I have some doubts about whether real estate will be kind of the big offshore assets, just because it has limitations in terms, it's not liquid, for example. You cannot sell like 5% of your house because you need some cash or stuff. So it's not always like a great asset for storing wealth. But otherwise, I mean, one thing I've learned, so now we have a project working on this information exchange with the Danish tax authorities. And one thing I've learned is that, shares that are not listed on a stock exchange are not covered by the information exchange. I mean, it was kind of a little bit mind-blowing to learn that a couple of years ago. That and so things like that. And I think it really, there's a good reason for it. It's just because like this information comes from banks and they have listed securities in their depots, and this is what they can report on and so on. So there's a good reason for it, but it's also a pretty blatant loophole. So you can imagine kind of wealth shifting to these forms that are not covered by these policy initiatives.
Okay, and I'm also thinking about sort of new assets like crypto assets. Is that something that again, relatively open question as to who wants to take that one?
I mean, I think we don't know really. I mean, so one thing is you don't need a tax haven to invest secretly in cryptocurrencies, because like it's secret by default. And I don't think anyone has that kind of data on like who the users are of cryptocurrencies. It's just because it's really a layer of secrecy we have not yet found a way to pierce.
Yeah. No, fair enough.
No, I think it's important also to recognize that we have an entire ecosystem of advisors who are always at the forefront of the legislators on how to avoid taxes, and they can help you invest into cryptocurrencies despite we don't know anything about it. They and recall that also the banks themselves, and we must talk about Danske Bank when we are here. The largest money laundering scandal in the world, where Danske Bank, as an advisor, facilitated Russian and East European oligarchs to launder their money. There's a financial ecosystem of banks, auditors, lawyers, financial sector wizards who enable this.
That's a good point. Aneta, you want to come in?
Yeah, we talk about all these problems with tax havens, and we've been working with this for a long time, and it's difficulty getting attention in the media and getting problems. I think one of the issues is always it's all about them. Like all of the bad tax havens, the others, it's not us. And it's like, that's kind of getting attention. So whenever many of the leaks have taken, the journalists have done a great job, like bringing the cases home, showing us that it's all about like us and what's going on here. But I think if we're going to have change, what we all want, more information, more transparency, like we need to start at home. Like, because we have all this, as Neil says, like the unlisted companies, we don't know basically who owns them. And like companies is a tool. It's a tool, but they also are like legal persons with the same rights for tax-wise that we are like as individual persons have. But the difference is that you can set up like new, you can split them, you can merge them, you can set up new, establish one and have them in chains, or even in Denmark, like you don't know who the owners are. So they are legal tools, but they can be used for like hiding activities also within Denmark. So basically having more transparency of owners at home, not just talking about out there. It's like we ought to start at home and basically ban companies with no activities who basically serve as like hiding tools. We can't start saying that tax havens should stop providing shell companies when we basically do that at home and allow that, and we also facilitate that. I don't know how it is in Denmark, but in Norway, like we have like removed the accountant duty for like small companies. We have like, so basically nobody is looking at them in the cards. Well, the tax authorities have got, but they haven't got more money for audits. And also we have reduced the cost of setting up. Like now in Norway, like is it 30,000 kroner you need to set up a like in share stock company? Basically, that's the value of an iPhone. It costs nothing, and you can just have it in chain. And we let that go. We're allowing that to go on. And for tax authorities to trying to see an activity of a firm, like are they money laundering? Are they doing like profit shifting? Are they having legit activities? It's impossible even in Norway or in Denmark to see through this layer of secrecy. So we should start at home to bring the debate home and not just talk about them. Okay, I've got engaged now.
But very good points, thank you. And Panos, I think that's a really good sort of segue into what the EU Tax Observatory has talked about as one of the areas that could be used to pull some of these strands together, the Asset Registry. Maybe just tell us more about like what your suggestion is on that.
Of course, yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are many initiatives going on. I know that there are ongoing discussions about cryptocurrency that are already starting right now, and ways to deal with cryptocurrency. And fortunately, from what I know, in Europe at least, member states are more or less aligned because they are also used in other kind of facilities. And then with the shell companies, there is also a new directive that is on the table, the Unshell directive. But what we have proposed and what we have approached the issue that we face today with the European Asset Registry is to have a European structure, a new European organization that is set up in the EU, where all the information are systematically linked and they're professionally recorded. So currently we have different registers. If you buy a car, you register it somewhere. If you buy a house, well, maybe you register it, maybe you don't, depending on the country. And so it's very difficult for countries at the global level as well, but also in the EU, that is a more integrated continent, to have information exchange between countries in a systematic way where all this information can be cross-checked. So this is what we have been advocating for. As I specified before, many of this information exists. It's out there. And that's a crucial point. We don't need a lot of effort to put this information together, put them in a common format so that countries can cross-check. Or if we set up a European structure, a common European structure, being in the EU or being a new structure with specialized personnel, they can also do the checks themselves and inform the different countries. So it doesn't take a lot, really. There are steps that the countries can take. They can improve the beneficial ownerships that they have in their own countries. They can introduce new measures like the unlisted companies, for example. Even for the listed companies, there is not entirely, we don't know entirely what's going on. There are some limits. Or limits to access as well. Some of these registers are not public. You have to pay to gain access for specific companies. So the job of people that deal with this becomes even more difficult, let alone what happens in tax havens or places with complete secrecy. But let's start from home. Let's build something in the EU where information can be exchanged in a common structure. That's what we were saying.
Okay, thank you. And I mean, I wanted to, I know Chine has had to leave us, but I wanted to sort of bring in some of the points that she was saying. And I know last, you were talking to many of the same points about how developing countries, in some ways, are more affected by this flow of illicit financial flows. So do you think then that, tax havens, there should be more, there's more focus basically on the impact of developing countries? Because we often hear about the sort of tax havens which are in the northern hemisphere typically, and the story about other developing countries gets lost.
I mean, to a large extent, as also Chennai said, developing countries are those who are most affected by capital flight, tax havenery. Unfortunately, in a lot of the measures that has been taken, they are not sufficiently included and can take advantage of some of the policy developments that we have seen that Rasmus spoke to over the last 20 years or so. And I think it's important, I believe, Panos, if the EU can take steps on an EU asset registry. I mean, I believe that what we have seen over the last decades is that the EU often is taking the lead in some of these policy measures. But as important, particularly seen from our perspective, that you consider and include in setting up these structures developing countries' interests, but also their voices, in order to make sure that it comes to advantage of those hard affected by the problem. And that means that it should be as easy for the government of Sierra Leone or Mozambique to find assets of their rich elites, oligarchs in the asset registry and take efforts against this hiding of the wealth.
Okay, thanks. I think, Rasmus, you had a question, and then we'll come to Niels.
Yeah, I just jump in there because, Lars and I have been discussing these things for a couple of years, and I think, Lars, can we feasibly say that you're the pessimist a little bit here, or maybe the realist, pragmatist? But I'm gonna call myself the optimist, and I think the situation on developing country involvement in these global tax systems is improving, and I think it's important to get that nuance up as well. That there are a lot of detrimental impacts of tax havenery, of some of the global tax issues that we see on developing countries, disproportionately so, and they have been for a long time not effectively included in and not effectively participating in the setting of these global standards, which have a huge impact on the extent of tax havenry, the locations of profits around the world. But just today, actually, just coincidentally, with some colleagues, I've released published a new paper that for the first time looks at how developing countries have actually been engaged in setting global tax standards over the last few years. And while there's still many constraints and barriers, what we also see is that there is now a pretty strong mobilization amongst certain low-income countries, and they're able to effectively represent their interests in some of these global tax discussions. On some points, not always on the big picture, but there are certain improvements in the right direction that I think we need to bring out. And this is not necessarily always as a result of big, large-scale collaborations amongst countries, but sometimes it's just a small group of selected individual, very knowledgeable, highly technically experienced experts from certain countries in Africa that are able to participate in some of these global negotiations and make their mark because of their skill and their knowledge. And I think it is still, I think it's worth repeating, a lot of problems, but there are also signs of improvements in this regard.
Yeah, can I
please.
comment on that? Yeah, so I think it's really a great point that we should probably do more to when we design these policies to think about like how they work, not just in developed countries but also in developing countries. And I think maybe the painful insight here is that then the information exchange might not be the solution, because actually when we've been inside the machine room of the Danish tax authorities for the last year and see how they work with the information they receive. And it's really, really difficult to actually use information that you get from abroad, match it to your domestic tax return, find out what is the implied tax liability. It's super complicated. It's not automatic to reap the benefits of information exchange. It actually requires a lot of bureaucratic capacity to do that. And maybe so I'll tell you just one anecdote about why this might not work. So once I was at a conference 10 years ago. There was a bureaucrat from the Isle of Man, and they just joined this automatic information exchange effort of the EU. He says, I know for a fact that Greece does not use the information we send them about Greek people's accounts in the Isle of Man. And I thought, how do you know? Well, because every year we send them a CD-ROM with the names of the Greek account holders, and it's encrypted. And they never get back and ask about the code. And this is just to say that, information exchange, it only works if you have the capacity and the will and the resources to actually use the information that people give you. And I'm a little bit worried, that if you would go to Burkina Faso or places like that, they will probably, even if they get a CD-ROM with all these names, they would, for many reasons, one would be capacity, another would be corruption, or that maybe they will not use it fully, right? And then you could think, are there alternatives? And I think, for example, one alternative that the European Union actually, in the past, used in the Savings Directive was to say, well, why don't we levy a tax in the tax haven? So we have the tax haven levy a tax on the income and send it to the home country. That's how the Savings Directive worked until 2014. Because in that way, these countries in Africa with a poor bureaucratic capacity, they'll just get a check every year and not a list of names, and then they can themselves go and find the money. And so this has limitations too, but I think it's really, if you take Lars' comments seriously, you also have to be open to thinking about, maybe we have not designed it in the right way from the perspective of developing countries.
It's a very good point and very interesting anecdote, slightly terrifying. I'm not sure. I wonder, how many, because it's not just, obviously developing countries might have more problems than some other developed countries in resource, but lots of developed countries also don't put as much resource into their tax authorities. So I just wonder how much is getting actually picked up and analysed by authorities. But I'm conscious of time, so I'd like to sort of move us a little bit closer onto the sort of solutions, which we started talking about a bit already, and also to just pick up on some points that were made right at the start about the impact of Russian, wealth and sanctioning that, and has that actually led to? I think it was it Panos who said that never let a good opportunity go, or was it Lars? Do you think that this moment is going to lead to sort of concrete change. Maybe Lars, if since you brought up the issue.
No, but I believe this is, never waste a good crisis, and Rasmus recalls me, this is a Friedman quote. When there's a crisis like the Ukraine crisis, let's look at, it's terrible, it's terrifying, it's a humanitarian disaster. But it's also an opportunity when we want to address the Russian oligarchs to push the Asset Registry, and that's exactly what you've been doing in the EU Tax Observatory. That is to say, okay, right now we got some policy proposals in our drawer, and we take them up and say, now in this time of crisis, there's an opportunity. And my recommendation is just that we widen this opportunity, not only looking at the oligarchs, but looking at rich elites across the globe, taking advantage of this and pushing this idea of the Asset Registry.
Okay, thank you. I think Anessa had something, and then we'll come to Panos.
Yeah. I think this is what happened over the last months show that the world, society, the countries can work together, and there's a joint effort for sanctions, their willingness to do something now, which hasn't been joint efforts haven't been real efforts before. We knew about these problems for a long time, but with problems with secrecy, but there hasn't been real willingness to do anything about it. And part of that is, like Neil said, we know that it's the wealthy who hide money, and with wealth comes power. So to do something about these structures, these global structures, is important. And I think it's important with all these new initiatives and these assets registries and stuff, but I need to go back to the S word. I was at D and talked about what needed to be done. And they said, do not say the S word, it will clear the room. And the S word is then, it's not a swear word, but it is sanctions. Because it was total, everything now is based on cooperation, and everything is the automatic exchange. We don't know if it's working. There's a lot of data sent back and forth. Nobody's allowed to look in the cards. Well, maybe you are, but nobody else. So there's a lot of resources sent back and forth between two countries. We're not allowed. So what we know about the hidden wealth, hidden assets, illicit finance, that's from journalists and researchers, not from governments. They do not have the resources or the data to check whether this is possible. So we have this very big, almost parody that we have more transparency and information exchange, but there's more secrecy because we're not allowed to see what's going on. And we also have tax havens saying, and also the Norwegian Central Bank used as an excuse to say, no, Cayman Island is not a tax haven because it's a member of the CRS. Well, Dubai is also a member of the CRS and exchange of financial information, but you see a lot of people hiding money there. So we need more. So we need sanctions. Why should some states make a lot of money, benefit from providing secrecy that hurt other states? There's a need of sanctions, and we need registries. But I've worked. Norway has among the best data in the world, and we've gone to these registries and having read in audits, go and try and find audit businesses around in the field, and half of them didn't exist. They were in registries, but they didn't exist because there was no basic penalty, but not updating registries. So registries are nice and good and important, but if the data in it is not updated, it doesn't help. Then you can have the opposite effect. So in order for that to work, we need basically sanctions, a cost for not following up the rules.
Okay, thank you. And just to say, Common Reporting Standard, if anyone doesn't know, that's the automatic exchange of information, financial information between tax authorities. So, yeah, and Panos.
Yeah, so many things to comment on. Not that I disagree. I agree with Lars, of course, that this is a great opportunity. So despite you saying it, I would repeat it, that, this is indeed an opportunity, and we jumped on this opportunity. And I think European countries and also others, everyone in the world should jump on the opportunity. In advocating for such a structure in the EU, there are different levels of ambition. So there is a global ambition as well. So ideally, this institution will have been global. But of course, we know from the current discussions on different global issues that this is very, very difficult. And what countries have tried to do now is indeed to set up task forces in the EU at least, and I think there is a transatlantic one as well, a G7 one, plus Australia, maybe G8, that essentially coordinate, and they have sanctions on rich Russian individuals, which are essentially imposed by different countries. But these institutions, these task forces, are essentially coordinating mechanisms between countries currently. So this is the level of ambition that has been implemented. We are just advocating for one step higher so that it becomes a structure. And within this, once it is a structure, and of course it's going to be based on some kind of a European treaty between countries, then you can introduce different elements in it. For example, an automatic exchange of information between countries every year, funds so that they can impose sanctions, and also if it's a treaty, then sanctions to countries that don't implement the treaty, so the European Court of Justice is also involved. And so we have all these European structures that have already been in place. What makes it a good opportunity? And we talk about an opportunity now. Basically, I would summarize it as this: country politics and party politics are pretty much aligned. So you would find opposition from some parties in the past in implementing different policies or sanctions, but it seems now some parties at least have changed their position due to the current crisis, and that's why we should, while being specific on the Russian issue, Russian-Ukrainian issue, we should take the opportunity, take advantage of this opportunity to expand to other nationalities as well, and to go to the heart of the problem. And then country politics are also aligned. So most of the countries, at least in the Western world, are very much aligned. So this makes it a great opportunity.
Okay. Well, staying with you, panelists,
Yes.
just wondered, what would you say is the first step in getting this asset registry established? And we're here in Denmark. I mean, what role would you like to see the Danish government play, for example?
Again, there are different levels of ambition. I know that already there is a study